Sticks Hexenhammer made a interesting comment, I think, regarding the Scott Adams situation. He was talking about how racism goes equally both ways, how, you know, he sees racism as white people complaining about how black people move into their neighborhood, whereas he believes that equally, obviously, there's a there's an equal response, an equal racist response from black people saying, they don't want they don't want white people in their neighborhoods. And I find that kind of interesting. It's I find it kind of interesting because it's obviously a flawed comparison. I mean, you don't see any white people moving into black neighborhoods, nor do you see black people in those neighborhoods complaining about white people living in the neighborhoods. Normally, the interaction on racial grounds is white people don't want to live with black people. They don't want to pay for black people's. They don't want to pay. They don't want to pay for the upkeep of black people. They don't want to pay for repairing riots. They don't want to pay for public education. They don't want to pay for public health care, that sort of stuff. Whereas black people, their racism comes in the form of, oh, you're much better off than we are, therefore we are entitled to getting money out of you. And this is clearly a Marxist influenced idea. So let's start at the beginning and define what racism actually is. Racism in its pure aspect is the belief that races exist. Okay, and that's obvious. There's nothing really wrong with being racist, actually. Obviously, be careful how you say that or where you say that. But yeah, ultimately, racism is about recognizing that there are differences between people from different geographic locations in the world. Obviously, black people have darker skin color to cope with living near the equator. They generally have longer limbs, which makes them faster sprinters. White people are generally lighter to deal with the low light conditions that they generally live in. Obviously, in Europe, it's very cloudy, and we have winter, cold winter. So we need as much sunlight as possible to generate vitamin D. Ironically, vitamin D helps with dealing with disease and health problems and all that. And I highly suspect that that's why black people in the West, or at least in Western countries that are higher up in latitude, have higher health problems. They have heart attacks more often. They have diseases more often. With the COVID virus, even depending on whether you believe COVID is more or less. It's not really a lethal thing. We'll leave the whole COVID discussion for another video, but it is a fact that black people, non-white people, were more susceptible to the virus because obviously they don't get enough sunlight in the higher latitudes, and that's what makes them more accessible to viruses, more susceptible to viruses. And so, yeah, we have these different physiological differences between different types of humans. In spite of what they say, we're not all just one people, and there are serious health implications for saying that we're just one people, as I just outlined. But back on the topic of equal racism, as Sticks Hexenhammer so put it. The problem with racism today is not that. Well, one of the problems with racism today is just sort of understanding what it means. So, if I was going to categorize the types of racism that exist in society, I'd give I'd outline them in two different types. The first being the racism of superior, where the people view themselves as superior to others, and in this way they seek to make distance between them and other people. They don't want to associate with lower people. They don't want to associate themselves with inferior people, because to them they represent a risk. They represent a societal risk, whether it be a cultural degradation, increased crime, less efficiency in the economic system, which you could say is the type of thing that happens when too many people take out government aid. So obviously, if your system has a lot of people that just sit around on their butts all day and get paid by the government, that's an inefficiency. If people aren't contributing to society and they get something out of it, that's a problem. So here I am working my job, 9 to 5, and I'm paying for infrastructure, for roads, for power lines, all that sort of stuff, as well as these people's education and their health benefits and all that sort of stuff. And I don't really get anything out of it besides the basic roads and power lines, which is ridiculous because I pay so much more taxes than is required for that upkeep. And so there's no real reason for me to desire to pay taxes because I don't get anything out of it. I mean, theoretically, if I just saved the money, if I got a group of people and we were to say, okay, we put this amount of money aside for whatever we need for our community, it would be a lot more effective and a lot more cheaper than if we were to pay the government taxes. So that's superior racism. That's the racism of the people who think they're higher and who want to build distance with inferior people to protect their own way of life. And honestly, I can't really see anything wrong with that. Obviously, hot take. Don't say that in modern politics today, but the idea of you freely choosing to associate with who you want to, there's nothing really wrong with that. Despite all the outrage that surrounds Scott Adams, that Dilbert guy, at the moment, he was talking about how he didn't want to live with people who hated him, and everyone sort of went wild. But yeah, that's just kind of the mentality at the moment, the brainwashed masses reacting. Although I wouldn't really call it brainwashed masses. I think the majority of people sympathize with this position and are just too afraid to say it. I think the majority of people actually have common sense, but are just too afraid or or are relying on people to speak up for them. And so that's an inherent problem that we need to deal with in the future. But here we get to the other part of the racism, which is inferior racism. And this is the racism of the people who view themselves as inferior. People who don't perform as well, people who don't have as strong as a culture, as strong as a history, like Black people, like Native Americans, those types of people who don't really have like the thousands of years of culture behind them, don't really have the conquerors' culture. Like, it's easy for Europeans and Asians to get along with their lives because we don't need to prove anything. But as an African actually put it to me, is that it's just humiliating to be an African or a Native American at this time because you basically got trounced without people even trying. Like Europeans and Asians to some extent, we just sort of walked up and took over. There wasn't any fight. There wasn't any like honorable last stand. There wasn't a good showdown, and the better man won. Or the better man did win, like for various reasons, technological, cultural, ideological. the betterment did, in fact, win, abolishing slavery, introducing medication technology thousands of years ahead of whatever they had in Africa or in the Americans or in the Americas at that time. You can't really compare it. You can't really say it's a negative thing. But it is humiliating for them. And so in order for them to feel like they're done right by in society, they feel compelled to drag other people down to their level. And this is a common action amongst people of color, especially in the United States, where they take umbrage with cultural ideas such as punctuality, working hard, and education. Again, looking at the Black community, they're the number ones. They're the number one people who promote the anti-white idea, the idea that they shouldn't adopt cultural aspects of Europeans because it insults their pride as a people. And it's basically a racism of self-destruction and the destruction of everything around you. And it's the only racism that I can actually tell is actually bad, because the racism of the superior is the racism which puts a boundary between people. It's the racism that protects culture and allows people to freely choose who they associate with. And the racism of the inferior is that which forces the destruction of boundaries. Essentially, racism of the inferior makes it impossible for people to freely associate, which we've seen in government policy lately, where starting in the 1960s, you had the government shipping non-white students into white schools for no reason really, other than to make more problems, cause community uproar and all that sort of thing. There wasn't a real good reason for it. And then as we've progressed, obviously certain races are taxed more than others. Again, another instance of the differential treatment of people in society today based on their race, ironically enough. And this is all to drag people down, to make everyone miserable, to make everyone suffer. And there's nothing, it's pure destruction. Racism of the superior is, I've already repeated it a bunch of times, so I feel stupid saying it again, but racism of the superior is protecting your cultural identity, protecting your people, and trying to make them grow. And that's not at the expense of other people, but many people see the success of other cultures and other people as an attack on them. They see that in order for things to be fair, they need to inflict suffering on others. In order for things to be fair, white people need to be stomped into the ground, and in their minds, hopefully they'll stay there. And that's the great idea. It's the idea that if you strip everything away from a people, which they're trying to do now, they won't be able to rise back up, and it will prove the idea that there's no difference between the races. But obviously, we don't really agree with that. There's no person that lives in reality that agrees that that there's equality amongst the races. Again, there's no equality amongst the races. There's better ideas and there's worse ideas, and some people just come up with the better ideas more often than others, and that's the result of thousands of years of history. And ultimately, the racism of inferiority, or as many more others would probably call it, Marxism, wants to drag down the people who are higher up to their level, and that's an act of violence and to make them suffer for no real good reason. But in order for them to feel good in society, they need to see other people suffering. And so that's the differences between the races. That's the main difference between the different types of racism. Yeah, this is my first sort of free flow video. Looking to do more of these in the future. And yeah, this is just an experiment. So next time, hopefully I'll be talking about spirituality and all that sort of thing. Sort of more of the building blocks of a society. I don't really like doing reactions, although it's super popular. I think we need to move away from being reactionary to being more to understanding our own ideology and how we would build a society off that. So yeah, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.